Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to have a very general discussion about ethics, a little bit about morality, and sort of why it matters, what's at stake. We're going to talk specifically about chapter 1 of Lewis Vaughn's book, Doing Ethics. There's a ton of authors out there that write on ethics, that talk about ethics and morality. This is one little piece that I think, in given how short it is, with relative to what it says, I think really just packs a punch. I think it's a really sort of nice introductory piece to ethics that students or general audience can access. So if you're interested in any way, just curious about the nature, the relationship of ethics and morality, between ethics and morality and philosophy and so on. This video will be just a really general introduction to some topics and some things that I want to highlight that the author says that I think is nice. So, welcome back to the channel. I'll see you in just a bit. Okay, let's get started. In this chapter, we essentially talk about, and what I want you to think about, the audience, right? Whether you're a student or you're just a general audience member, you saw the hashtags or something and thought this would be interesting. The general idea here is to get you to consider the difference between ethics and morality, because there is a difference. At least philosophers tend to make the distinction. I'll talk about that in a moment. Between morality and ethics. And I want you to consider why it's important to think about morality and ethics, or at least ethics, right? Why we need to spend time studying it. Why there's classes like Introduction to Ethics or various other ethics courses and so on. Why there's a section of ethics in an introduction class. Why if you're studying business, you might have to take an ethics class. Or if you're studying nursing, you might have to take an ethics class. Or why in church they talk about ethics and so on. So I think this is all very interesting. I think it's important. And Lewis Vaughn talks about this as well. And I think he gets out of the gate just running. And I think it's a really important point. Something I've emphasized over the past nearly 2 decades now about ethics. And that is, it is inescapable. Simple as that. You can't run away from ethics. You can't run away from morality. We'll talk about the distinction here in a little bit. But it's unavoidable. Humans deal with the rest of the world. You don't live in a vacuum. You're not on an island by yourself. You don't make the rules. We're part of a group of people. We're part of societies or cultures or various ethnic groups and political groups and so on. It's not just you. In that, then, we have to contend with other people. We have to deliberate with other people. We have to consider the situations that we find ourselves in. And the fact is in those various situations that we have with each other, that we're involved in with each other, we have to make decisions. We have to make decisions that affect our lives, and we make decisions that affect the lives of other people. We talk about what's good and what's bad, what's right and what's wrong. All of us do. Doesn't matter if you're a priest or a politician, a parent or a professional, right? We talk about what's good or bad, what's right or wrong. We talk about how we deal with each other, how to talk to each other, about what's good and what's bad. There's just no escaping it. So, with that in mind then, let's talk about the distinction between ethics and morality. Now, typically, when I'll poll people and ask them, there's some predictable answers that people give us. So for instance, if you ask somebody, just your quote unquote average person, what morality is and what ethics is, typically, not always, but typically you're going to get something like morality is the set of beliefs about what society subscribes or says is right or wrong, good or bad. Well, ethics is either one's personal notions about what's right or wrong, good or bad, or some sort of professional notion like business standards of conduct and so on. There's variations of that, but typically that's kind of your general distinctions, that there's two different ways of looking at those words. There's ethics on one side, there's morality on the other, and they're two different things. One involves something closer to personally or individualized standards of correctness, right and wrongness, and a more general or societal type standard of correctness or right or wrongness. It's very common to hear that. Now, an initial problem with this, and if you sort of stop and take a step back and ask yourself if that distinction really makes any sense, and I think we run into some problems pretty quickly. Do we really think there's a difference between these different standards of what's right or wrong? Just consider the following general problem. If we believe that each individual has an absolute right to judge what's right or wrong, good or bad, and that those judgments in fact are correct, then what do we do when person A and person B have contrasting, conflicting, or even contradictory beliefs about some situation? This person says it's wrong, this person says it's right. Who's correct? Now, if you say they're both correct, then that means action X, whatever action that is both right and wrong. What if it's the murder of a child? Do you let the person off who says, no, it's right? Or do you put them in jail because the person who says, no, it's wrong, says it's wrong, right? There's this basic conflict. Presumably, if killing a child is wrong, it's wrong regardless of who does it. And this is kind of the flavor of what we're sort of looking at here. Now, we're going to talk about things like relativism in another video, moral relativism, and just relativism regarding truth and falsity. But right away, we can see that maybe it's not the case that each individual or each social group or ethnic group or what have you has an absolute right to judge what's right or wrong, and no other group or body or individual has a right to say otherwise. Otherwise, we're deadlocked. There's a difference between morality and ethics. So let's sort of loosely define it as the following. Morality, we tend to say, is the set of beliefs, attitudes, judgments about what is right or wrong, good or bad. So maybe you or your family group, or maybe a larger friend group, or even a larger ethnic group, or even a larger cultural group, or even a larger societal group, right? Maybe each of those groups says that this is right or wrong, this is good or bad, and this group may or may not agree with what that group says. Maybe there's some similarities, maybe there's some differences. In any of those cases, they're all involved in morality. They're all involved in the game of saying such and such is right and such is wrong. In that sense, all of us, to some extent, deal in morality. We all have judgments, attitudes, beliefs about what's right or wrong, good or bad. And all of us, again, from priest to pastor, from professor to politician, we all talk about what's right or wrong, good or bad. In your family, in your friend group, and in the business meeting. What's right or wrong, good or bad is important to us, and we call involvement in those judgments of what's good or bad morality. Ethics philosophers tend to say, is the study of morality. It's to take those judgments, beliefs, and attitudes about what's right or wrong, good or bad, and philosophically investigate them. Ask about not just what those beliefs and judgments are, but how do we arrive at those beliefs and those judgments? How do we justify the truth and falsity of those beliefs and judgments? So if we say X is wrong because, A, B, and C, and we list our reasons for why X is wrong, then to do ethics is to ask about whether or not X is actually wrong given the reasons that are listed. In other words, it is the job of a philosopher to do ethics. It's the job of a philosopher who's doing ethics to say, what do you say is right or wrong? What are your reasons that you think justify what is right or wrong? And let's look into whether or not the reasons you give are actually true and what the relationship is to the claim that you're making. It's sort of a second order intellectual function here that we're doing. So there's a difference then between the claims of what's right or wrong, good or bad, and inquiring into whether or not those claims are true or false. And in ethics, that's what we're doing. We're inquiring into the truthfulness or the legitimacy or the logical cogency of the claims about what is right or wrong or good or bad. So ethics studies, to varying degrees, the claims of morality. And the claims of morality, once again, are the claims, the judgments, the beliefs, and attitudes about what is right or wrong. So, from a philosophical standpoint, we make this distinction between morality and ethics. We are looking at ethics in this class. Okay, so there are some drawbacks, according to your author, about trying not to do ethics. So maybe you say, oh, well, ethics is just whatever you want it to be. There's no universal standard. There's no such thing as absolute truth or falsity. Ethics is just what people think or what they say or just what is handed down to them and so on. So maybe you fall on that spectrum. And your author points to some interesting aspects here. One, if that's your attitude, if you actively try not to do ethics, not to get involved in the justification of what's right or wrong, good or bad, then one thing that's at stake is your personal freedom. Consider your beliefs about what's right or wrong or good or bad come from somewhere. And it's probably not the case that you deliberately sat down and strictly evaluated and analyzed those beliefs and independently came to those beliefs about what's right or wrong, good or bad on your own. You were influenced somehow and probably at a very early age. Just like you hold the proposition 1 + 1 is equal to 2, the mathematical proposition 1 + 1 is equal to 2, just like you hold that to be true, you've probably never questioned that before. It's one of your oldest beliefs, and you've had it since you were, as my dad used to say, knee-high to a grasshopper, since you were very small. Right? What's the justification for it? It is an inherited belief that you've probably never actually thought about to a great deal. Can you actually prove that 1 + 1 is equal to 2? And if you do the finger 1 and 1 is 2, you're just restating the thing that I'm asking you to prove. It's a really interesting problem if you've never thought about it. More than likely, what you claim is right or wrong, good or bad, is a part of a larger culturally inherited set of beliefs. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. That's true for all of us. All of us have beliefs and attitudes that we've inherited since we've been children that you might not even think about. Our job as philosophers is to be cognizant of that and then to ask those subsequent questions. How do we justify those things that we say are right or wrong, good or bad? And so if you never question morality, then part of what's at stake is your personal freedom, because all you've ever done is just accept what's taught to you. Now, we want to avoid biases, right? So we want to avoid going into our investigation already set on finding proof that what we believe in is true. That's it's called a confirmation bias, right? You believe something, you're going to set out to find the evidence for why the thing you believe is true. We don't want that. What we want to do is look at the reasons and arrive at a conclusion regardless of what that conclusion is. So if, again, all you ever do is just accept those cultural beliefs and attitudes that have been handed down to you since you were a child, to what degree are you actually free? Because all you've ever done is believe the things that are part of your native culture. Really interesting dilemma. Another thing that we lose is the ability to intellectually grow, moral intellectual growth. When we think of growth, when we think of intellectual growth, at least as I think about it, we think of alternative possibilities. If all you do is stagnate, you stagnate because you don't accept alternative possibilities, the way things could be. The presumption that you're right and no amount of information could change that, could change the way you believe, means that you have rooted out the possibility of alternatives and you stagnate. There's nowhere to go. And if you're concerned about moral development, if you're concerned about becoming better, or things were worse then and they're better now, or we want to avoid things getting worse now, morally speaking, if you're involved in that type of language of moral progress, that things are better and worse, then not doing ethics undermines that. Not doing ethics means that you are relying solely on either your native, inherited sort of cultural beliefs and attitudes about what's right or wrong, or you're saying something like your intellect alone is enough to justify the claims that you already believe in. Those are not intellectually fruitful places to be and can undermine this notion of moral growth. If you don't do ethics, another reason that might undermine this idea of moral progress is you would lose the ability to sort of defend yourself. In ethics, when we talk about the justification of a claim, this is the language of argumentation, conclusions, right? And premises that justify the truth of those conclusions. This is the nature of argumentation. If all you've ever done is just sort of accept those claims that are given to you and you never question them, then you don't have much and you won't have much to intellectually defend yourself about why the things that you believe are true or false or right or wrong are the way they are, because all you have is merely the ideas of what you've inherited or what your social group thinks is right or wrong. It's a really interesting, again, position to be in. The lack of the intellectual ability to work through the claims that you have and justify them intellectually, logically, reasonably, puts you in a fairly morally and intellectually precarious position. And we want to try to avoid that. Finally, if all of this that we've said is true, then frankly, you simply increase your chances that you're going to be wrong. If you never explore, if you never branch out and actually investigate whether the things that you think are right or wrong, good or bad, are actually right or wrong, good or bad, and or whether or not you even have an actual legitimate justification for them, then you increase the chances that the thing you believe in is probably wrong. You can't defend it. You don't know about alternative possibilities. You probably don't know much about moral theory or moral reasoning. And if you don't care about any of that, then what do you have to go on that justifies those things that you claim to be right or wrong, true or false? It undermines it undermines the nature of justification if you are incapable of self-reflection. If you're incapable of changing your mind given evidence, then you're just increasing the chances that the thing you believe in are wrong. And if you are right, then it's something like a lucky guess. You happen to be right. It wouldn't be knowledge necessarily, because there would be no process for arriving at the thing. It's just unreflective, something you've inherited, or something you just believe, but believe without reasons that you can work through and therefore justify. So 4 reasons for why not doing ethics actually undermines the whole project of being ethical, the whole project of having moral claims to begin with. Okay, moving on. Your author in this chapter talks about the ethical landscape. And there's a couple things I want you to pick up on that I think are interesting when we think about morality and ethics in particular. We want to distinguish between value and obligation. Now, when we talk about value, we're talking about what's right or wrong, what's good or bad, what's praiseworthy or blameworthy. When we say, murder is wrong, that is a value judgment that we're making. We're saying that X, in this case murder, when we say it's wrong, we're placing a value on it. When we say donating to charity is good, we're placing a value on that action. And we're saying in one hand the value is bad or wrong. On the other hand, we're saying the value is good or right. And we tend to praise things that we say are good, and we tend to blame things that we say are wrong. So if you're involved in an action that we say that we have valued to be bad, right, then we say you're wrong. We blame you for it. If you're involved in an action that we say is good, then we praise you for it. That's just sort of a natural way that we do things. It's part of that inherited moral language that I was talking about. Now, digging further, when we talk about value, we talk about intrinsic and instrumental value. Instrumental value, when we say something is instrumentally valued, we mean the value of the thing in question, whatever it is derived from the benefits that thing offers. So if I say, for example, this camera that I'm filming on, if I say this camera is good, or it's good to have this camera, then I'm making a value judgment. And that value judgment is based on the, if you will, usefulness of the camera. I can use the camera to do this, this, and this, and it's because of that I say it's good. If the camera stopped working or was irreparable, if it broke, could not be used anymore, and I had to junk it, right? Say I dropped it and it got crushed, I couldn't even sell it for parts. Then I would say it's a bad camera. It doesn't work anymore. It's no good. It is no longer good. Right? So instrumental value. Now, when we talk about morality and ethics, right, I'm not going to get too much into this in this video, but you want to ask yourself, when you say something is right or wrong, good or bad, is it based off usefulness? This idea of usefulness? So when you say murder is wrong, do you say it's wrong because it harms people, because it undermines trust in society and so on? Or do you think murder is wrong for some other sort of more innate, inherent reason? That murder is wrong because it's wrong, not because of something, right? Not because of some outside condition, not because of how useful or distasteful it is, but is murder wrong simply because the act itself demands that it's wrong? And this is an interesting concept. What we're talking about here is the notion of intrinsic value. Now, I'm not going to pretend here to sort of fully understand what intrinsic value here means. I am convinced that not many people, if anybody, actually understands the nature of intrinsic value. But there are ways we can talk about it. And there are some examples that I can use. I'll give you one that really brings out this notion of intrinsicality. So, for example, thinking of the murder example here, keep that in mind. One thing, for example, we say that is inherently valuable, right? That is inherently good, is we say life. We say life is good not because it lets you enjoy things, or you can do this, or you can explore that, and so on. Now, certainly life is good for that, right? Life is good for knowing things and getting out into the world and experiencing. Certainly that's true, but we tend to think, and check yourself and ask yourself how you feel about this. Don't we also say that life is good for its own sake? Life is good for the sake of being alive. And that's the true worth of life? Or maybe another example. What about sort of talking about humans and human life as well? What about human dignity? Don't we say that human life is dignified? And there's various arguments for, say, like abortion, for example, that rely on this notion of human dignity, that human life is worth saving because it is dignified, because it is the thing that it is, not because of other reasons, not because of our intelligence, not because of what we can do in the world, our opposable thumbs, right? But human life is inherently dignified because it is human life and for no other reason. Now, I'm not asking you to believe this necessarily, but certainly you can see a difference here. Some things are good because of what they bring us or what they can do, and some things we say are good simply because they're that thing. And that's what we mean by intrinsic value. Obviously, everything we're talking about, we could go much, much, much deeper into. Right now, I want you to see that there is a difference between instrumental value and intrinsic value. And when we talk about morality, more often than not, although there are notions of instrumental value to be sure, and we'll talk about some of that in some later videos, nevertheless, it seems that what we're getting at when we talk about the nature of morality and ethics, we're talking about the intrinsic nature of goodness and badness. So, consider that for a second. When we talk about ethics and doing ethics, these differences and distinctions between instrumental and intrinsic value. Okay, so that's one, is value. There's ways of talking about value. The second thing that we consider when we talk about ethics are obligations. So it's one thing to talk about value. What's, goodness, rightness, wrongness, badness, that sort of thing. Whether goodness is instrumental or whether goodness is intrinsic. Those are interesting, deep philosophical questions, and they have long histories and very interesting, lively histories, and involve much of current debate in ethics. But then we also talk about obligation. It's one thing to say what's right or wrong, good or bad. It's another thing to ask, in light of what's good or bad, what should I do, or how should I act? How ought I to act? Right? It's one thing to say what's good or bad, but just because something is good or bad, does that mean I should do something then? Does it mean I shouldn't do something? Should I act a certain way with the knowledge that something is good or bad? When we talk about that, we're talking about the language of obligation. Do I have a duty to act in a certain way? Am I obligated to do this or that, given that I have some understanding about the nature of goodness, the nature of badness, and what is right and what is wrong? Should I or should I not act in certain ways? Now, in your typical, if there is such a thing, ethics class, intro to ethics class or philosophy class or whatever, it's pretty rare you're going to have an instructor say, this is what you should do. kind of undermines the whole point of these classes. It does happen from time to time. But as philosophers, as teaching philosophers, as educators, it's our job to get you to consider this very complex relationship between value and obligation, between the different types of value, instrumental and inherent value, in relation to how you should act in the world. And go back to what we said before. You don't escape ethics. You are already caught up in the language of morality. What's good, what's bad. It's your personal beliefs, it's your family beliefs, it's your social group, it's your ethnic group, your larger community, and so on. You're already involved in it. Right? It's another thing to ask about the justification of that, about what you should and what you should not do. And going back to Lewis Vaughn's point, you don't escape that. And if you don't escape it, you might as well spend some time thinking about those relationships. After all, you're going to go vote. You're going to be friends with people. You're going to donate your money to something and so on. You're going to get involved in the things that humans do. It's worth investigating our claims and our ideas and beliefs and judgments about what's right or wrong, good or bad, and consider things like instrumental and intrinsic value in relation to what I ought and ought not to do. Very interesting. Okay, now, when we think about ethics, some things stick out. When we do ethics, when we are involved in studying morality, when we're involved in investigating the reasons for why we claim certain things are right or wrong, there are some things to look for. And as Lewis Vaughn points out, one thing to look for is the predominance of reason. When there are conflicts between moral claims, X is right, says one group, X is wrong, says another group. A predominant aspect that sticks out is that there is a rational, reasonable process that human beings with the minds and brains that we have can approach those problems. We can logically and rationally work things out. Now, whether we do or not, of course, is another story. And there's a lot involved in that. But we can work out. We can analyze, right? We can consider the conflict and all the details that go into it. And we can arrive at some sort of mediated judgment. Again, that doesn't always happen for various, possibly political or religious reasons, but it's possible. And that's kind of the point here. When there's a conflict, we, more often than not, look to reason to try to solve those conflicts. Really sort of interesting if you think about it. If you ever get into an argument with a friend of yours or something, and you reach a sort of moral impasse, what are you going to naturally start doing? You're going to naturally start using that logical part of your brain to analyze where you, or more often than not, your opponent went wrong, and you're going to try to find some sort of contradiction or some sort of inconsistency in what they said. You're going to naturally sort of do this, right? So one element to look for in ethics is the predominance of reason. Another aspect to look for is what your author calls the universal perspective. There's some element of universality in our discussions about what's right or wrong, good or bad. I alluded to this earlier. When we say something like murder is wrong, right? So if you, for example, say murder is wrong, do you mean that murder is wrong for you? Right? Like, how committed are you to the idea that there's no universal standard, right? That the individual, or maybe even a social or ethnic group, gets to decide what's right or wrong, good or bad. When you say murder is wrong, do you mean that it's wrong for you? And it may or may not be wrong for somebody else? If that's the case, if somebody else says murder's okay, who's right? Do you get to punish the people who say murder is okay and in fact murder? Because remember, right? You say it's right or wrong for you, and it may or may not be right or wrong for somebody else. It's a weird sort of conflict. Or when you say murder is wrong, do you mean it's really wrong and anybody who's engaged in an act of murder is doing something wrong? Are you sincere in the claim that murder is wrong? If you are, then you probably fall on the side of a universalist or a universal perspective, right? You say murder is wrong, you mean it's wrong, and whoever engages in murder is wrong. Or abusing a child, or cheating on your taxes or something. If it's wrong, it's not like other people get an exception to the wrongness. If it's wrong for me to cheat on my taxes, then it needs to be wrong for you. It's the only way it makes sense. If murder is wrong, then the only way it makes sense is that it's wrong for everybody. It's not like, well, it's wrong for you, but I get to murder. You probably don't believe that. But if you have the attitude that, oh, well, truth and falsity is a matter of perspective, then that's what you're allowing. You probably don't mean that. And when we do ethics, this is indeed what we look for. We look for this universal perspective when we start talking about the justification for our claims about what's right or wrong, good or bad. Another aspect we look for is impartiality. We want our moral judgments, our moral beliefs, to be impartial. We want to have our judgments not just be sort of applicable all the way around, but we want to make sure that we're allowing the relevant information into our belief system, right? We want to be exclusionary here to information that is not relevant or bad information or, emotionally charged information. And we want to allow the information that is relevant to the thing that we're talking about. We want to be impartial in our judgments. We don't want to favor one thing over another. Not just universal, that a claim applies all the way around, but we want to make sure that when we arrive at those universal claims, that we've done so impartially, as unbiased as we possibly can. Finally, another aspect of morality is this idea of what your author calls the dominance of moral norms. When we have our disagreements, right? Say maybe there's a legal disagreement about something. And maybe a certain law says that X is illegal. We'll often tend to think because it's illegal, it's wrong. But perhaps that the law might say something is wrong, and yet our moral intuitions say, well, but that's not right. And that's what this predominance of moral norms talks about. That in the end, we care about the moral value of things. And if a law says something that contradicts our best moral thinking, we tend to change those laws. We want our laws, our legal codes, to reflect our moral thinking and not the other way around. Were it the other way around, then no matter what law you enacted, as long as that law passed and was on the books, then violation of that law would be bad. That means you can enact any law as long as you had a majority, and you've therefore established morality. We don't want that. It's arbitrary. There's no ultimate standard for why you should enact one law over the other. It's the other way around, in fact. We want laws that are morally sound, and we want to get rid of laws that are not morally sound. And if you look at the history of our lawmaking, we see this trend. And that's just one example. It doesn't have to be just about law. It's just sort of the immediate thing that comes to mind. The dominance of moral norms tends to be a predominant feature of ethics. We recognize that our moral claims are what are important to us, and we want to work on those moral claims. We want to investigate those claims, and we want to shape the world around us based on our moral thinking. I think these are interesting points that your author picks up on, and interesting for you to think about. Okay, one final thing to consider. Your author points out, and in an ethics class, typically, we understand that ethics and morality do not rely upon religion. In fact, religion and religious people need ethics. Now, religious people and non-religious people are both involved in morality. Both religious believers, regardless of what religion it is, and non-religious people, both groups of people believe and use the language of rightness and wrongness. Something is right or wrong, something is good or bad. There's different ways of arriving at why those things are right or wrong, good or bad, and this is kind of the point. But nevertheless, both groups of people, religious believers and non-believers alike, both believe that certain things are right or wrong and good or bad. This is an interesting thing to think about. Believers, religious believers, still need reason. They need principles of logic. Now, and they use them, whether they're aware of it or not, whether you're aware of it or not, whether you're a religious believer or not, we tend to use certain principles of logic. We can't go over that right now necessarily. That'll be for possibly another video. But we recognize, for example, contradictions. We realize when one claim, right, doesn't work with another claim, even if it's the same subject, right? Person A says this is right. Person B says this is wrong. We can recognize that immediately. Right? We might not have the answer to it, but we recognize that there's a problem. That's a logical principle that we're using. And there's some of this that we do naturally. Believers still need reason. They need these, religious believers still need these logical principles when it comes to saying what's right and what's wrong. If a religious believer says abortion is wrong, for example, they're going to provide, or they need to provide, reasons for why that claim is wrong. That's the language of argumentation, which is an intellectual process. In religious debates, and there are religious people who believe, I'm just going to stick with the abortion example, there are religious people and groups of people who believe that abortion is right, and there are religious people and groups of religious people that believe that abortion is wrong. And when it comes right down to it, each has their own, let's just say, religious way of approaching that claim, and each has their own religious way of settling that claim, but we still recognize there's a conflict. And where ethics steps in is it uses reason to try to evaluate the conflict and solve it. And both sides, at least to some degree, inherently use logical principles when it comes to that debate. Ethics can help mitigate those problems. Studying ethics can actually help us solve those problems better, and can help us better understand our own religious positions so that we can come to a more reasonable and rational conclusion about what's right or wrong and good or bad. From a religious perspective, in this same sense, continuing this idea here, ethics can enable productive discourse. Ethical and moral discourse take place in a context of shared meaning that we have. When we talk about justice and fairness and equity and the common good, it is a common context that all of us share. Again, I don't live alone. I'm part of a group. I get to be me because of my involvement with other people, because I'm part of a family or a social group or at work or something, right? It's not just me. And because I'm in these varying groups, there's a shared context of meaning within those groups, and some of them overlap and some of them are not so close together. But when we talk about things like justice, fairness, equity, we're talking about these notions of shared context and shared meaning. And ethics where there's discourse in our religious, let's say, infighting about these things, ethics can step in and actually ask us to be productive in those discourses by trying to talk about these things in reasonable, rational ways. And again, can even give us a stronger basis for approaching our own religious perspectives. Religion isn't the only moral sphere here. It's not the only way of doing ethics. And in fact, if you are someone who claims that there is no morality without religion, then you are ignoring the long, long, long human history of secular writing on morality. In fact, I would go so far as to say is the majority of writing on morality, the majority of ethical writing on morality is probably secular, is non-religious. You have sort of the predominant ethical views, utilitarianism, Kantianism, deontology, and so on. Virtue ethics, whether it's Aristotelian or sort of neo-virtue ethics and so on. There's all sorts of different ways of talking about what's right or wrong, good or bad, that's not religious. And even within a religious scheme, there's still varying ways of talking about what's right or wrong, good or bad, even within a religious context. And all of this points to the fact that morality does not rely upon religion to talk about what's right or wrong, good or bad. There aren't just other religious ways of talking about it. There's a ton of other systems and other ways of thinking about what's right or wrong and good or bad. Religion is only one sphere out of many ways of talking about what's right or wrong, good or bad. Let's just give one example quick. Let's say you're a religious believer and you say that whatever God commands is good. Right? If God says do this, then to do that thing is good, and to not do it would be bad. Why? Because you're going against God's commandment. Let's suppose that God commanded somebody to murder. Then the ethical question arises, is that a good thing? And there's a conflict here. And we recognize, certainly from at least a legal perspective, that whether or not God commanded you to murder, if you murder someone, then from a legal standpoint, that's wrong. Not necessarily morally wrong. Legality and morality are two different things. But certainly from a legal standpoint, you'll have done something wrong. And assuming there's the evidence, then, you be tried to go to jail or possibly executed. But that gives us an insight into this sort of basic problem. So let's suppose God actually exists and God commands you to murder. Do you murder? Is it actually right to go through with that commandment? Or could you be doing something wrong? Relying on the religious injunction doesn't solve that problem. This is a problem for rationality. This is a problem for humans in human context with human rationality to decide, taking in all relevant information, trying to be impartial, and make those judgments applicable to all rational people. Even religious claims need ethics. In other words, morality itself, our claims and attitudes and judgments about what's right or wrong, good or bad, requires human intellectual involvement. And according to Lewis Vaughn, your author, that we're considering here, it's inescapable. So we might as well take the time to investigate. I want to end this little bit with a quote from the book. I'm using the second edition of Doing Ethics, put out by, who published it? It was Norton published this. And I'm on page 12 here. It's the paragraph right before the summary, and it's the midway through that paragraph. Vaughn is here quoting Jonathan Berg, and he says, quote, Those who would refuse to recognize as adequately justified any moral beliefs not derived from knowledge of or about God would have to refute the whole vast range of arguments put on by Kant and all others who ever proposed a rational basis for ethics. End quote. He continues, moreover, if we can do ethics, if we can use critical reasoning to discern moral norms certified by the best reasons and evidence, then critical reasoning is sufficient to guide us to moral standards and values. Since we obviously can do ethics, as the following chapters demonstrate, morality is both accessible and meaningful to us, whether we are religious or not. So my invitation to you is to take an ethics class or an intro class or wherever you find yourself in the park and to think about your ethical position. Consider your moral claims, the things that you think are right or wrong, good or bad, and ask yourself, what reasons do you have for believing those things to be right or wrong, good or bad? And are you willing to change your mind if different information, better information, comes along? This is an incredibly valuable skill that intellectual human beings such as yourself have and can and should develop. Your author and myself invite you to pick up this activity, work through it, and see where you end up. It's an incredibly rewarding experience. So that's it for this video. I appreciate your time. If you would like to hear about something else in the future, please drop a comment. I can't get to everything, but I'll certainly do what I can. And always remember, this world is far, far more complicated than what you think it is. And when you stop, take a step back and look, you're going to see things differently. And I urge you to reflect on that complicated nature of the world and try to engage with it in a more intellectual and moral manner. I'll see you next time.